A warm welcome, dear audience, distinguished guests, ambassadors, members of international networks of archives, researchers from all over the world, those viewing on Zoom, and those of you tuning in on LinkedIn. Welcome to the launch event of the Guidelines for Identifying Relevant Documentation for Holocaust Research, Education and Remembrance. My name is Veerle van den Dalen and I am the Deputy Director, General Director and Director of Collections of Research at Kazerne d'Ossat, Memorial Museum and Research Center on Holocaust and Human Rights in Belgium, and I will be moderating today's event. I'm also a member of the Belgian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, international organization, an intergovernmental organization that deals with issues around the world related to the Holocaust and the genocide of the Roma, including education, remembrance, and research. I'm also the deputy chair of the IHRA project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections, which was responsible for developing these new guidelines. But first, some information on technicalities. So we have activated the chat function for those joining us on Zoom, and in LinkedIn, one can use the comments function. And we intend to have a short question and answer session at the end of this event following our panel discussion. So if you have further questions or comments, you can definitely put them already during the event in the chat or in the comments, and otherwise, or if we were unable to answer your questions in time, please send an email to info@holocaust-remembrance.com. I am very, very pleased that this new resource has the support of so many at the IHRA and beyond. And we will begin with a round of remarks from IHRA Chair Ambassador Anne Bernice, IHRA Secretary General Dr. Catherine Mayer, and IHRA Project Chair on Monitoring Access to Holocaust Collections, Dr. Hein Gärtner. Let me begin by introducing Ambassador Burns, the IHRA Chair for the Swedish Presidency. Mrs. Burns joined the Swedish Foreign Service in 1994 following a distinguished career as a journalist. She has held a number of assignments related to security policy, human rights, the European Union, and the United Nations. She most recently served as Ambassador for Gender Equality until her current post as IHRA Chair during the Swedish Presidency. Ambassador Bernice, we are honored to have you here with us today. Please take the floor.
Distinguished guests, dear heads of delegation, I'm honored to be able to address you here today to launch the IHRA Guidelines for Identifying Relevant Documentation for Holocaust Research, Education and Remembrance. This event thereby also marks the completion of one of the pledges made by the IHRA at the Malmö International Forum held in October last year. These new guidelines address an issue that is all too common, familiar to us all, I think. Researchers being prevented from accessing Holocaust-related material. However, access to archives and information is important not only for academics and students. It is important also for educators, genealogists, jurists, journalists, and all members of the public who try to understand the present and the past. As a former journalist, I can absolutely confirm the significance of being able to access archives when you're trying to trace a development pattern or even a decision that can explain the current situation. Access to archives is also important for victims, survivors, and their descendants, since it allows them to reclaim their histories and their identities. Let me give you a concrete example of the importance of accessible archives. Many know the name of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat and businessman who, in the face of great danger to himself, saved thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary. All over the world, there are streets and monuments dedicated to Wallenberg, as well as numerous public institutions. And in 1963, he was recognized as one of the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. Alongside the many accounts by eyewitnesses of his inspiring deeds and courage, the access to archives has allowed scholars to provide us with an in-depth understanding of not only what Wallenberg achieved in Budapest, but also how and even why. Sadly, though, there are still question marks surrounding his fate following the arrest on the 17th January 1945 by Soviet forces in Budapest. The access to various archives, primarily in Russia, would help in the efforts to understand exactly what happened to him in captivity. Meanwhile, the Raoul Wallenberg case remains open at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Access to Holocaust-related archives means access to a better understanding and knowledge of the past, knowledge that is important in itself, but also has an impact far, far beyond Holocaust research. When the record of the Holocaust is safeguarded, when all of society can research, learn, and teach about the Holocaust, when the facts of the Holocaust are abundant, then anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and all other forms of incitement of hatred and violence are less likely to occur and spread. Access to archives helps counter disinformation like Holocaust distortion and anti-democratic narratives. So, by helping societies deal openly and accurately with the past, archives help them to uphold democratic principles and respect for human rights. Access to archives plays a critical role also in advancing the IHRA's vision, a world that remembers the Holocaust, a world without genocide. The motto of the Swedish presidency of the IHRA, as you can see behind me, is Together for Impact, promoting Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism and anti-Gypsyism through cooperation and dialogue. By honoring our commitments through cooperation and reaffirmation to access archives and information on the Holocaust, we can, together, achieve this motto and move closer to the vision. I personally very much look forward to the discussion today and to continuous dialogue on these guidelines throughout the Swedish presidency and beyond. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Bernice, for these kind and inspiring words. I very much look forward to the upcoming activities of the Swedish presidency. We are also pleased to have with us today the IHRA Secretary General, Dr. Catherine Meyer. Dr. Meyer holds a PhD in history from the Technical University in Berlin, where she specialized in denazification and re-education in Germany after 1945. Prior to her work at the IHRA, she served as advisor on anti-Semitism issues at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. As IHRA Secretary General, Dr. Meyer implements the priorities of the IHRA chair and IHRA member countries. She has held this position since 2008 and has overseen the process of adopting the organization's various working definitions and the 2020 IHRA Ministerial Declaration. She has been an important supporter of the IHRA's work to safeguard the record of the Holocaust by advancing access to archives. Dr. Meyer, welcome, and please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Werner, for this very friendly introduction. Excellencies, distinguished guests, and dear friends. Advancing access to archives is part of IHRA's DNA. One of my favorite parts of the Stockholm Declaration, the founding document of the IHRA, is Article 7. It reads, "We share a commitment to throw light on the still obscured shadows of the Holocaust. We will take all necessary steps to facilitate the opening of archives in order to ensure that all documents bearing on the Holocaust are available to researchers." Our experts always have their ears on the ground, taking the heartbeat of the complex archival landscape. This allows us to swiftly respond to opportunities and to threats to access. This was the case when we helped to open the Arlington Archives and the Vatican Archives. And it was the case with the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU. The GDPR is a necessary response to the digital world we live in. But many of you may not know that it almost made Holocaust research close to impossible. Even before it was adopted, the GDPR was being used to preemptively bar researchers from accessing archival material. This was obviously very far from the intended effect of this legislation. The IHRA stepped in to make sure that the new privacy regulation would support and not prevent archival research. As a result, the GDPR, through recital 158, explicitly encourages access to records related to the Holocaust, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The guidelines being launched today resulted from a similar process of close analysis, international consultation, networking, and action. They bring us one step closer to fulfilling the vision outlined in the Stockholm Declaration and its reaffirmation in the 2020 IHRA Ministerial Declaration. Being a historian myself, I know all too well the feeling of being denied access to material. But access is important, not just for historians, not just for experts in the field, but for society as a whole. That's because access to Holocaust-related material is critical to countering Holocaust distortion. Unfortunately, the last few weeks have shown us only too well distortion's disastrous potential. We all try to raise awareness that Holocaust distortion is a disgrace towards the victims of the Holocaust, that it is being used to whitewash history and to support anti-democratic movements. But now, it is a distortive lie about denazification that underpins the entire propaganda narrative justifying this war of aggression against Ukraine and the killing of men, women, and children in Ukraine, among them Holocaust survivors. Protecting the facts is more important than ever. But to protect the facts, we must have access to the facts. It's been over 75 years since the end of the Second World War, and our work is far from over. But especially now, it is essential that we continue. The guidelines being launched today and the deep interest of all those joining for this discussion show that we are moving in the right direction. And this is why I would like to end by thanking all colleagues involved in the developing of these guidelines and encourage all of you to put them into practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your strong support and encouragement. I would like now to give the floor to the chair of the IHRA project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections, Dr. Chaim Gertner. Chaim is the director of Yad Vashem's International Relations Division, but until recently, he served as the director of the Yad Vashem Archives. Whether using technology to make Holocaust-related documentation more accessible, working together with others to build up the European Holocaust research infrastructure, or leading the IHRA project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections, Chaim has contributed greatly to safeguarding the record of the Holocaust and to helping make sure that researchers can continue to shine light on this history. Chaim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virle, very much for this kind introduction. And thank you to Ambassador Bernes and Dr. Meyer for your statements. As Dr. Virle van den Delen mentioned, I am the chair of the IHRA's project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections. I lead the project not alone. I lead it with Virle, and hand by hand with our excellent researcher, Elinor Correitoro, and with 13 IHRA experts and delegates from 10 countries. And I would like to thank all of them for the partnership and devotion. I would like to talk briefly about how these guidelines came about, because when we started the project, this resource was not planned. The work of the project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections is motivated from a frustration that in spite of our joint efforts in IHRA and in other institutions, there are still Holocaust-related archival collections that are not accessible to the public. As Dr. Mayer explained, advancing access to Holocaust evidence is part of the IHRA's DNA. So, as Dr. Mayer mentioned, when in 2016, the EU presented its new data protection regulation known as the GDPR, it became clear to us that unintentionally it may prevent access to Holocaust material. So directly due to IHRA's intervention during the creation of the GDPR and in full cooperation with the EU, a legal solution was found to enable, in principle, free access to Holocaust material as reflected in Recital 158 of the regulations. So following up on previous work on access, our project wanted to continue map and monitor the legal and practical status of access to Holocaust material and identify challenges faced by archivists, researchers, and civil society. As part of these efforts, the project group noticed a serious lack of understanding as to which materials could be considered Holocaust-related. So Recital 158, for example, wouldn't be enough if you will not mention or relate to the definition of Holocaust material and into its relevance. For example, classifying documentation as Holocaust-related should be implemented in an open-ended way, both geographically and in terms of time of creation. Geographically, Holocaust documentation can originate from sources anywhere in the world and could be held today in any country. The temporal parameters of Holocaust documentation extend backward to the beginning of the 20th century until present day. Testimonies, memoirs, and other victim sources, documents concerning compensation, restitution efforts, and commemoration can date to this day. Also, in many cases, the description of the files in the archival catalog does not necessarily imply that the documents in the file are Holocaust-related. This lack of clarity and lack of guidance was affecting Holocaust research on the ground. For that, we created those guidelines for all the users and for the gatekeepers, those who hold potential Holocaust-related materials in their collections and institutions, but not necessarily consider them as relevant to Holocaust research. We knew that we could lean on our strong contacts to archival networks like the European Archives Group, EAG, the European Board of National Archives, IBNA, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, ERI, and the European Union Diplomatic Archives, EUDIA, when developing the guidelines. They have been closely reviewed by those networks and the IHRA expert community, including Professor Yuda Bauer, Professor Wiffer ten Haver, Sir Andrew Burns, and many others. And they have been met with a very positive response and were officially adopted by the IHRA Thessaloniki plenary in December 2021. Since then, they have already begun to be adopted and implemented by ERI, for example. We hope that these guidelines will help archives fulfill their missions and help researchers uncover and learn about the past and support Holocaust education, remembrance, and research, both of which are critical to democracy and to our world today. This is intended to be a practical tool. We want this to be a document that archivists have printed out, scribbled on, and sitting next to them on their desks when they make case-by-case decisions on whether a document is Holocaust-related. But that is only one side of the coin. Researchers, the public, should also be making use of the guidelines. I would like now to show a short video that illustrates exactly this point.
I came across Malva Shaluk's work while writing my dissertation on art as a form of resistance during the Holocaust. I was struck by how her art captured life in the Theresienstadt ghetto. And I was inspired by her courage. She refused to paint the portrait of a collaborationist doctor and then was deported to Auschwitz. Malva's no led me down a rabbit hole of so many unanswered questions. I searched online and collected what I could, but I couldn't find answers to all of my questions. So, I turned to the archives. At first, it was easy. I managed to piece together some information from documents in different countries, but there was still so much I didn't know. When I finally found official documents that would shed some light on Malva's life before the war, I was denied access. Because the materials were dated outside the Nazi era, the archive didn't consider them relevant to my research. They cited privacy regulations, one of the many barriers researchers face. I sent the archive a copy of the guidelines from the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I explained how documents from a wider time period could still be relevant, and that it was in their power to waive the privacy regulations. They finally agreed, and I could carry on unearthing more of Malva's story, her family, education and interests, everything that prepared her for the moment when she would say no. Malva's no inspired me years ago, and it will continue to inspire many others. There are still so many untold stories and unanswered questions about the Holocaust and its impact. And the answers are in the archives.
I'm sure we'll come back to this video and the themes presented in it during our discussion. And so I'll pass the floor back to you, Virle.
Oh, thank you, Chaim. And again, a huge thank you to our three speakers for their kind words, and also to everyone who contributed to the making of this video. Today, we are joined by a panel of three experts who interact with archives on the Holocaust and Holocaust material in very different ways. So please let me welcome Dr. Michael Hollmann, the president of the German Federal Archives and a member of the European Board of National Archives, or IHRA. Nevena Bajalica, a researcher, educator, and co-founder of Terraforming, an organization in Serbia which promotes human rights, diversity, and tolerance while combating discrimination, intolerance, anti-Semitism, anti-Roma racism, and all forms of xenophobia. Nevena is also a member of the Serbian delegation to the IHRA and a member of the IHRA project on monitoring access to Holocaust collections. And Ernst Steigenga, the National Delegate on Holocaust Remembrance, Education and Research at the Dutch Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sport. Ernst also serves as the Dutch head of delegation to the IHRA. So a warm welcome to all three of you. And let us begin with the concept of open access in general. According to the guidelines being launched today, open access describes a set of principles that allows researchers and the public to find and use Holocaust-related documentation for research, education, and remembrance. The concept is meant to encourage archives to implement these principles with good judgment in a way that balances interests of privacy with the competing imperatives of open Holocaust research. And in the video we just watched, open access plays a pivotal or crucial role in the researcher's ability to paint as complete a picture as possible of this history. So Nevena, as a researcher and educator, what does open access mean to you and why is it important for your work? Could you relate with themes that we've seen in this video?
Yes, definitely. In our work of developing teaching materials, we in Terraforming focus on the lives and destinies of individuals, families, or groups. Not seldom do these life stories unfold in multiple European countries. It could start in a tiny Serbian village in Kozara Mountain, today in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then lead to Jasenovac concentration camp in Croatia, then to Staro Sajmište near Belgrade in Serbia, then through Austria and Germany, far north to Falstad camp in Norway. These are true examples of shared European history, where local microhistories connect into a larger European experience. It would be impossible to trace and research such stories without cooperation with international partners, experts, archives, and institutions.
Exactly. And Michael, if I may, as the head of one of the most important archives in Europe, why should archives work towards advancing open access? And what does open access look like for an archive?
Hello, everybody. Well, in recent days of the Ukraine war, everybody can see and realize the importance of access to historical information. History as argument was and is powerful in political and even in armed conflicts. Therefore, archival sources as fundament of all historical knowledge should be accessible to everybody as free as possible to enable everybody to develop his or her own historical narrative. Having this in mind, open access to archives is a representation of freedom of information and a fundamental precondition for any open and democratic society. And that's what archives are for. That's the raison d'etre of every archive.
Exactly, yes. And then Ernst, why is open access relevant and important to policymakers? Why should policymakers support efforts to advance open access, especially when it comes to material related to the Holocaust, crimes against humanity, and genocide?
Well, thank you, Veerle. Thank you, distinguished colleagues, to allow me to be among you. For a number of reasons, it's very important to have open access to the archives. And the importance struck me while drafting the country report for the Netherlands in 2020. The blatant brutality that was to the victims of the Holocaust and genocides were exposed calls for a comprehensive and transparent approach to the investigation into these atrocities. The investigation, of course, must address the acts of violence during the Holocaust and during the genocides. However, just as important is the investigation of the abuse, of the fragile situation, the victims that was impeded upon them, and also when restoring that into the life after the atrocities. So it's not only about what happened, it's also about restoring. And the realization that retribution, restitution, or regaining one's own belonging after the Holocaust and after the genocides has turned out to be a massive struggle for these victims. And this sentence is what policy officers should bear in mind when it comes to the importance of open access to archive. And moreover, there is much to be learned about the process and course of victimization during the Holocaust and during genocides. We can sometimes discover the guidelines that were followed by the perpetrators. So therefore, it's critical for the descendants of victims to gain access to archives, be it in documentation, be it in witness testimony, to be better informed and for a better understanding and offer new insights into what happened and what are the mechanisms that operationalized these atrocities.
Right. Thank you, Ernst. And with that in mind, we also know that privacy regulations are sometimes applied too stringently, too strictly. What are some of the factors that contribute to that, Ernst?
Well, I'm a government representative, so it's a little bit hard for me to really come up with a very open question, but I'll do my best. So at the surface, one could say, bearing up with all these instructions to access the archives or what's happening is a real tedious job, and it's really legislation is changed so often that it could be, a matter of capacity, competence, whatever, like to hold it up. But that's just like, that would be the easy way out. I think a far more fundamental, but also very important aspect to bear in mind is that there's an interplay between different acts that influence the access to archives. So of course there's the archival law in many countries, and then we have the GDPR, and then we have the Freedom of Information Act. And the interplay is really complex, because for the open access to archives, these are the ones that are very important in the Netherlands. But all of these free acts have an interplay with a whole different set of acts in a different context. And then all it has to compute again. So bear in mind with the legislative lawyers that they will be willing to help you out. But there's also another side to the topic that we have to be aware of, and that also are fighting for attention. However, there's another thing, and that's far more psychological, I would say. I have learned from my other position in government that if people from different branches and then also of different build meet, they tend to get very risk averse. So they will be very tight because they do not know what the other one is expecting of them, and they will be afraid to open up too much. And in the beginning, it will be very, very tight, very stringent. And then they will see that the public cannot work with these stringent regulation, and then it will ease down. So you have to be a little bit patient with people within the government. They try to do their best, but you have to be a little bit patient, I would say.
Okay. Well, we'll try, but making sure that privacy regulations don't unnecessarily infringe upon the freedom to research is very important to us. But we do understand also that there is a balancing act that both researchers and archives have to play between the right to privacy and this freedom to research. For example, what happens when the documentation deals with the life of a survivor who donates this, but who does not necessarily want to be identified, as he or she is too traumatized to talk about it anymore. And so, Michael, in your experience, how does the archive manage this balancing act, and when does it become especially tricky?
Well, I just can speak for the Federal Archives, but in our case, the most important means of balancing freedom of information and privacy rights are moving terms of closure, which are, of course, in many cases can be shortened or suspended, especially for scientific purposes, if there is a serious reason to get access. But this decision to suspend terms of closure can be tricky, especially in some cases. For example, in the case of photographies showing murdered people or victims of medical experiments. It's horrible. And in these cases, it can be a question of human dignity to refuse access if there is no serious reason for a scientific or personal reason to use especially these photos, for example. And so we have to do this decision in every single case, but often or regularly we do not have serious problems, because we did not have problems to by having no, I have to change the word. Very few people had problems when we showed to the public, to researchers, materials where their predecessors have been mentioned. But sometimes it will be, especially in these cases I've mentioned, but normally there are no problems.
So also not to anonymize people in the records, for example.
Well, anonymization is a serious problem, and we have some experience to that in the case of the records of the former State Security Service of the former GDR, where we are forced by law to anonymize records, even if we give access to the victims, which the records deal with. But this means that we have to at least to triplicate or to quadruplicate the staff who gives access to that. And as long as we do not have any AI supported tools, it will be very difficult to give to use an anonymization as a regular tool.
Right, and that actually brings me back to you, Niven, now, because how would anonymization affect your own work and that of the researcher that then comes after you?
When it comes to education and memorialization of the Holocaust, we already know the importance of revealing faces and names behind the numbers and unparalleled power of the personal story in education. We know that in order to engage, inspire, remind, invite, challenge, and encourage, there is nothing that compares to an individual story. The two most difficult challenges we face today is in education, in memorialization, are Holocaust distortion and necessity to demonstrate the relevance to this history today. Our best and most powerful tool has always been a local personal story based on the local microhistory and local Holocaust record. This approach is also a cornerstone of archival pedagogy. Data anonymization would make all such efforts ineffective and meaningless. Anonymization is the undoing of revealing local microhistories. Sanitizing information for privacy protection would get us back to faceless, gray, detached, generalized statements, which were ending in the Holocaust fatigue.
Okay, yeah. So of course, this balancing act is complicated even further because research is often an international project, as you already pointed out at the beginning of the meeting, and there's no unified standards of access, especially regarding privacy regulations, because recital 158 is a recital and is implemented in various ways in national legislation, therefore complicating things a little further. But the guidelines that we are launching today encourage a broad and an open-ended approach to identifying Holocaust-related materials. And they address some of the common misconceptions about Holocaust-related material, like the time frame or the geographical span. And adjusting our approach to these materials can really make a huge difference. So, Michael, which sources do you know of that could be opened up by taking this wider approach to identifying Holocaust-related materials?
Well, I'm quite sure that there are nearly no important archival sources in the Federal Archive or in other state archives which would be opened up for the first time by applying the wider approach of the guidelines. But I'm sure that there is a lot of, especially private archival material in private collections, for example, in private companies, whose potential for Holocaust research will now be discovered. And finally, I'm of good hope that many governmental organizations who still have relevant, I'm sure, relevant records in their houses, in their rooms, that they will deliver all these records finally to the archives.
Yeah, that would be really a good thing. So, and Nevena, how do you see the guidelines supporting your research?
What we are often facing in the work with archivists is particularly in the smaller archives, provincial archives, but even in the more prominent archival institutions, is the lack of understanding of what Holocaust-related record means. There are two levels of this problem. Firstly, archivists believe that the Holocaust-related documents are only those connected to the times of war and directly related to the crime, such as, for instance, anti-Jewish orders or acts by occupying powers, and it's similar, deportation lists and similar. The archivists often miss the point that in addition to the record of the crime, we are looking for the record of the life, pre-war life, everything that can contribute to understand what used to be, but also the period after the liberation, how the survivors face the new realities. The second level of this problem is that archivists might be well aware of specific local Holocaust events and personal stories. Still, they believe that no one would be interested as these stories are very local, while the big and important history took places everywhere, elsewhere in big cities and the larger killing sites like Auschwitz. And we are missing stories about the entire communities that perished in the Holocaust, stories about survival, resistance, helpers, or perpetrators that could contribute to a better understanding of this complex history and continent-wide genocide that unfold in many different ways in different places. In other words, archivists need additional professional training in this field. In this context, IHRA guidelines for identifying relevant documentation for Holocaust research, remembrance, and education bring a significant contribution and support our efforts to teach archivists.
Okay, well, thank you. And then Ernst, you've actually already made use of the guidelines in your work. Could you explain the role they played in reviewing implementation of the GDPR in the Netherlands?
Sure. Well, after the Thessaloniki plenary, I stalked Dr. Gertner a little bit for getting the outcomes of the material of the comparative research into the different archives, and I took the outcomes and the concept or the draft guidelines to the policy unit that is working on the revision of the Implementation Act of the GDPR in the Netherlands. And I took it to the National Archives. And one can imagine that at first there was some kind of defensive attitude towards the outcomes of the comparison. And I must say that, of course, a comparison between 4 countries always leads to some kind of defensive and whatever. But I thought it was really great how they grow into the understanding and also the appreciation of the guidelines that stem from this comparative research. And once it really had sunk in to what it might bring to the archives themselves, and also how to relate it to Parliament and to the public, it helps structuring the dialogue between the legislative lawyers that are working on the revision of the Implementation Act of GDPR, the legislative lawyers and the policy officers working on the new Archival Act in the Netherlands. And so it became something like a tool. And I think the most important thing at this stage is that we actually got to the point that we had brought these people together. So the legislative lawyers for the GDPR, the policy officers for the Archival Act, and the persons in the National Archive that have to work with these kinds of instructions. So finally they met, and it will take some time for it really to sink in and really have it work in a way that Dr. Gertner, Nevena, and you will hope it will work. But I think bringing together people is the one thing that we should really be working on, and that these guidelines really bring to the IHRA community, and which the IHRA community can bring into the local, well, you know, into the local situation, into the local context. So I would say a big thank you to Chaim, Veerle, and Nevena for all this good work. But it's really, I think it's really, really useful. And thank you so much for that.
Okay, well, we'll extend that to everybody who contributed to working with us. And let us continue this conversation together with our audience by taking some questions from the chat now. And let me also bring in Chaim back to this conversation for the Q&A session so that he can possibly also answer questions. And as a reminder, if we do not get to your question, or if you would watch this launch event at a later moment, please feel free to contact us and send your question to us via info@holocaust-remembrance.com. And so we have received one question in the Zoom chat from the IHRA Honorary Chair Yehuda Bauer on drafting an IHRA statement on archival material in Ukraine. I would like to acknowledge it and flag it for the Permanent Office, the IHRA Secretary General, and the IHRA Chair. There's already some discussion in the chat, but I would also like to ask a question to Michal. How are archives both inside and outside Ukraine responding to the war in Ukraine? How will this impact Holocaust education and remembrance in this region?
Serious problem. Well, for the moment, there are some initiatives to give our Ukraine colleagues as much support as we can give, but you can imagine that's a little bit problematic for German archivists to go to Ukraine and to say, please let us help you to safeguard your records. They have some experiences with German archives and archivists. So for us, it's up to give the lead, for example, to the Polish colleagues, and to make our Polish colleagues sure that we will be there with material and with manpower and with our repositories if we are needed for that. So it's a very serious problem to get these huge amounts of records, which are very often in not a very good condition, to get by lorries or whatever to the border and to bring them to, for example, to Poland. I have to confess, I'm not sure if there have already been some transports for that, but by historical reasons, for this moment, we are in the background, in the back office to support the Polish colleagues who are very in the lead for that.
Yeah, and I also wonder whether it will be possible to continue to rely on Russian ones. What is currently going on this front, and anyone from the panel is welcome to jump in and answer these questions.
Well, for the moment, I think we do not have to fear for that the Russians will destroy special archival materials. What is the most important danger is that they will gather and bring it to Russia, and that would be for us as problematic because we do not have good access to all archival material in Russia, and although they often declare that everything will be accessible, we really have a serious problem to access archival material in Russia, and we do not know how they will handle it with material they now pick up from Ukraine and bring it to Russian archives. I'm not sure what will happen.
Right. Anybody else from the panel who wishes to address these issues? Otherwise, I can change the topic a bit and take it to Nevena or anybody who'd like to answer. But Nevena, from your experience, can you give an example of when you've been denied access to material?
That is, I should say, I didn't have experienced real denying the access, but it was more like trying to convince them that the archives they are having are important for us. That's that kind of not really censorship, but I think a lack of knowledge of why it's important for researchers to enter an archive. It's not really denying access, but it's more like a no, we don't have anything what might be interesting for you, and we are just a small archive, we don't have anything, and
yeah.
That's more that in my experience.
Yeah, Alex?
What I could say something about what happened lately in the Netherlands. I think it is a very interesting trend that by I think since mid last year, a number of countries follow, or a number of municipalities follow the example of Amsterdam by looking into not only looted art but also stolen property, real estate. And more and more cities are looking into their archives about what has happened to the real estate. And it had been, well, we can say it has been stolen from them, and it has been legitimized by acts that, ended up in the archives. And it all seemed very legitimate until the moment you start realizing what has happened. And I think especially this part, by realizing it's not about only looted art, it's not about taking lives, but it's also about really stealing property and trying to legitimize and seeing what has happened to, to the victims, but also to those who have abused, this abuse of the situation. That is really, that needs to become, being brought across and brought out in the open. And I think therefore as well, of course, a lot of these are known, but these facts are hidden in the archives, and they should be opened up. And then, like, I think this research is really, really important also for restoration and, making whole again, like, what has been taken away. So I think this part is really, really important.
Right. And then Chaim, you mentioned in your speech that IHRA was already making use of the guidelines, and could you elaborate a bit more on that and the process behind it?
IHRA, as I assume most of you know, is a European project with partners from Israel and the US as well, that is working jointly to map and to give access and tools for access to Holocaust-related material worldwide. And by that, the approach is holistic. So the need to map Holocaust-related material, and first and foremost to ask what are the new expanding needs, the new research questions that researchers and the public are asking, led to a huge expand of the borderlines of Holocaust-related research. And so there was a very interesting discussion between the IHRA project and IHRA circles, and the IHRA circles are very big, about that. So from this audience of researchers, we have learned a lot about the new needs and also about difficulties. So this is why I was not surprised that IHRA was the first to adopt it as a working tool, because it's needed. Because if you work worldwide and you want, for example, to not only to work with official state archives. I mean, in the case of Dr. Holman, it is easy because he's, in this case, an archive meant to give access usually to its users. But when we talk about churches, when we talk about high schools, when we talk about our educational systems, when we talk about private collections, when we talk about, let's say, Red Cross in institutions that have their collections not for usually the use of outside users, but for internal use, then the issue of access becomes much more complicated. So I think this connection created or expanded or reflected, was reflected in the work that we did in the guidelines, and I'm sure that others will be able to use it as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Chaim. And a question to you all from the chat. Do the guidelines also encourage access to documents related to the genocide of the Roma? And how can access to such material also counter anti-Gypsyism?
I think that it is in a lot of ways generic. So when we are opening the eyes and the hearts and putting on the table the other options that are much open-ended of the definition of our research theme, it can be helpful for all kinds of research about Holocaust and other related victims.
If I may add, I have with me now, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's about the Sinti and Roma in The Hague, my hometown, which is a result from profound research into the municipality archives. And I think it's very important to really, you know, put an emphasis on the Roma and Sinti atrocity as well, like, you know, that covered or that were brought onto them. And I think, therefore, as Ambassador Ann Berner said as well in the beginning, the importance of these guidelines do really also address the importance of the working definition on anti-Semitism and the working definition on anti-Gypsyism. I think there is no doubt that it's so, you know, it's really, really important that we bring them all together. And therefore, I think, you know, from a Dutch perspective, we can be very proud of the work of IHRA. So I think these guidelines are really a centerpiece in the work of the IHRA and really brings on to a next level of knowledge about the Holocaust, and also bringing into restoration, restitution, retribution to the victims and the descendants.
Right. Then we can take another question. There's one that we received from the Zoom registration form to Ernst. One person was especially interested in the problems Dutch researchers encounter when trying to access, for example, transport lists. They say this is a very difficult and even sometimes impossible because of privacy laws in the Netherlands. Can you speak to this a bit?
Well, as I just said, indeed, it's true that there might be issues. Of course, I'm not aware of this specific issue, and I cannot address this specific issue. But we are working now on the revision of the GDPR, the Implementation Act on the GDPR, but also on archival law is being revised. And I think it's, for this person, very important to really get in contact either with the National Archives or with you know, there's a group of archival specialists that really are working on letters to the Parliament to convince them to move in a certain direction. And I think this is very important. But one should bear in mind that with the transport lists, there are a lot of names on the transport list, and I think there's something. But then again, I must also emphasize the whole goal of the recital 158 in the GDPR is to be less stringent with these kinds of personal data.
Right. Well, as we are close to 5 o'clock already, we would like to ask our panelists whether they have any final words before we wrap up. So, Michael, any final words on this panel from your end?
Yes, just some words. My main hope, having the guidelines in mind, is that we will have new ideas, which records, which material could be interesting for the history of Holocaust, which we did not expect that they could have a potential for Holocaust research. For example, Chaim knows the project, the so-called Wiedergutmachungsproject in Germany. I don't know the English word for Wiedergutmachung. Perhaps you can help me with that. But it proved to a lot of people in Germany that we did not ask every material we have for the potential of these research. And now I'm very hopeful that there will be new ideas and some things which will be compensation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, or reparations.
Thank you.
Like that. Yeah.
I'm hoping that there will be a new approach to the topic, taking it wider than it was until today. And so I think it can be an opener for a lot of new research.
Thank you so much, Michael. Nevena, any final words from your end?
I saw a comment by Richelle Bat-Kaplan, and I should share with everyone. I think it's really important. It's not talking about the importance of the access, archival access, but also like fostering the new generation of researchers who would work in archives, and that's really important. That is what we are also trying with our educational material, to get young people to go to archives and research archives as the best places to find data.
Absolutely. Ernst, from your end?
Well, I could echo Nevena. I think these guidelines are an instrument for a higher goal, and that is better knowledge of what happened in the Holocaust and Porajmos, but also to have a more open view on the historiography of what happened in the description of the Holocaust afterwards. I think that's also very important, and also that can be found in the archives.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And Chaim, I will give you the floor at the very end of this meeting. Thank you so much, everybody, for sending us your questions. And again, please feel free, if your question comes to you later or you're watching this at a later moment, to send an email to info@holocaust-remembrance.com. Also, if we were not able to answer your question here today. So I would like to thank the panelists again for their participation and for sharing their unique perspectives on this issue. And I would now like to give the final word back to Chaim, the project chair, for the concluding remarks, which will then end this launch. Chaim, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very lively discussion and for the thought-provoking questions. I was very impressed, I have to say, from the worldwide participation in the event today and from the very lively discussion in the chat. Well, this issue is, of course, far from being resolved. But I hope we are moving in the right direction, and that the guidelines will be an important step. Now we need to make sure they get into the hands of those who will use them. So visit holocaust-remembrance.com, find your answers. To download the guidelines, you have the link in the chat. There you will also find support materials to help promote them, like a text for newsletters and a flyer that you can share with your networks. You'll find the video we watched earlier, which you can share on social media. And you'll find talking points to help you start conversations with your networks about access to archives. Again, access to archives is not a niche issue. It is something at the heart of democracy. It is critical to countering Holocaust distortion and safeguarding the record. Thank you to all who attended the event this evening. I hope you were inspired by today's discussion and will make use of the guidelines to help you find your answers. Thank you.